You don't want to think that way. You want to think, all I got to know is what test to order, and it'll either be positive or negative. It ain't that way. Nothing in medicine is that way. So you've got to get comfortable with the ambiguity, and you've got to get facile with how to use a likelihood ratio. The likelihood ratio of an ST segment, let's see. So here's what they came up with. The likelihood ratio of a prior abnormal stress test is 3.1. The likelihood ratio of the patient, if the patient says, if you know the patient has peripheral artery disease, is 2.7. Pain radiating to both arms is 2.6. The most useful electrocardiographic finding in this study, ST segment depression, had a likelihood ratio of 5.3. And any evidence of ischemia, remember we've been talking about ischemic changes, flip T waves, convex ST segments. Any evidence of ischemia has a likelihood ratio of 3.6. Those are very useful likelihood ratios. A likelihood ratio of 1 means it doesn't move your pretest probability anywhere. A likelihood ratio of 10 says that's one of the best tests ever. So 3.6 ain't bad. Ain't bad. Now, I'm going to teach you later, maybe not this morning, I'll teach you later how to use the likelihood ratio without a calculator in your head. You got to do about 4 arithmetic manipulations to get it done. But it's just arithmetic, okay? No integral calculus involved, no differential equations involved. It's arithmetic, and you can do it in your head, and you can do it at the bedside. All you got to know is what's the likelihood ratio, and you don't even really have to know what the hell a likelihood ratio is. So it's the new clinician's way of thinking, whereas we used to just say, what's the hemoglobin, what's the serum sodium? We're now saying how good is that as a diagnostic test, and how good it is has to do with the likelihood ratio. But the most important thing this morning is that experience is the whole key to clinical medicine. And what you're doing with these EKGs is gaining a remarkable amount of experience at interpreting them. I walked in this morning, I've done this all month, and you're just in small groups. What'd you get there? What'd you get there? What about this? What about that? That's so different and so much more valuable than memorizing a bunch of factoids. So you're doing well, you're doing good. Thank you, Paul, for the question. If someone can write me a script for some sleeping medicine, that's great. Okay, what are we starting with, 51? All right. Amanda.
So, sinus rhythm, heart rate with a little slow rating at 55, ER of 0.16. The QRS was about 0.14 to 0.08 if you went off of lead 1 or lead 2. QT was about 0.48. Normal axis at 60 degrees. I noted inverted T waves in V1 through V6. Also a little in AVL. So for conclusions, I put long QT because of the prolonged 0.48. Bradycardia and ischemia and interior septal and low lateral walls.
Any additional or different interpretations? Okay, so on the exam, that's 100%. On the exam, you'll have an EKG, and one of the A, B, C, or D's will say sinus bradycardia, anterolateral ischemia, and prolonged QT. That'll be one of the choices. And everything else will be not quite as good. Okay? There might be long QT on one of the other choices, but it won't. But the overall answer won't be as good as the one with all three of them on there. Does that make sense?
What do you think of those P waves in 2, 3, and ABF?
P waves in 2, 3, and ABF.
They looked big to me, so I put away to right atrial one.
You think what?
They're big.
Tall or wide?
Peaky.
P,
Like a witch's head. No?
P as in tall?
Yes. Yeah. As in the first one. The first bump that would do.
Oh,
the
you
right
mean
atrial
in
one.
lead 2?
And 3. And there was some in ABF.
I'm not impressed.
Okay.
So they need to be quite impressive, and I know at one point in time we said 1/3 of the height or more.
Yeah, Marriott says the P waves need to be 1/3 of the height of the R in that lead. I don't know, that's sort of a rule of thumb.
And I think that's what's confusing, because look at 2, where your QRS is not very tall at all, your P is almost just as
Big.
tall. See where that.
In lead 2?
I'm sorry, 3.
3
Oh,
and
in lead
ABF.
three.
ABF is about 1/3 of it too.
Right.
So that's 2 out of the 3 leads.
So that's, I think, again.
What's 2 out of 3? Looks to me like
I thought
1.
for right atrial enlargement, we looked at lead 2, 3, and ABF for tall P waves. So 2 out of the 3, I mean, that's more than 50%.
More than 50%. Not really. I mean, in lead 2,
No, not the P wave itself, but, so to call
Contiguous leads.
yeah, contiguous leads. So like to call a septal ischemia, like you had to have both of them, because one of them isn't that impressive, where if you have 2 of the continuous leads out of 3 of them, that's,
yeah, I don't see 2 of anything in 2, 3, and F regarding the P waves.
okay.
So it's gonna have to be impressive for you to call it. And this is where the outlying rule is kind of messing you up, because you're trying to make it a hard basket. So understanding that is going to help you out. If it's gonna be on the test, it would be obviously really tall and peaked like a witch's hat. Okay?
If you were in a EKG lab and you were just reading the EKGs, you weren't the clinician. If you were worried about the P waves in 2, 3, and ABF, or 2 and 3, you might say, I wonder about right atrial enlargement due to the P waves in lead 3 or something like that. But
And
I
you
don't
would be
think-
wrong, so what test would prove right or wrong at that?
yeah, you do an echo.
Correct. And that's all you would need to know.
52. But I like the way you asked the question. The way you asked the question was, how do you feel about the P waves in 2, 3, and 8? And my answer is I'm nonplussed.
And for example, because like look at this one on 2, 3, and ABF, the P's are barely there and the QRS's are very distinct. So again, I can see where you're coming from, but try not to make that a die-hard rule. And again, if you were in clinical, it would just be get the echo and wonder about it. That's it.
52. Bethany.
Okay, I got sinus rhythm, heart rate of about 75, PR 0.6, QRS 0.1, and QT is 0.32. I got a normal axis with +65. I saw inverted T waves in 2, 3, ABF, and V1 through V6, so I said ischemia to the anterior lateral part.
Infralateral.
Oh, yeah, that's my
Infralateral what?
ischemia.
Ischemia. Okay. Any additions here? See how good you're getting? the ability to conform to reading is taking place.
So she called 2-3 and ABF as far as T-wave inversion. Did you call the lateral ones out, or did I just miss that?
Yeah, she said anterolateral and inferior.
Oh.
Yes,
I put anterior, lateral, and inferior.
That's what he just said.
injury.
Oh, sorry, I didn't hear you. I thought you just said inferior lateral. I didn't hear you say anterior, sorry.
Anterior lateral and inferior. Another way you could call this is inferolateral or anterolateral and inferior. But probably it's more correct to say there's inferior findings and anterolateral findings. And when you say it's anterolateral, you're implying that the septum is involved, right? 53. Cassidy.
Would that be transmural since it's throughout?
No, transmural would mean, you're asking really, is it panmural? And
Right.
yeah, you could just say there's ischemia everywhere. And that's a little unlikely, isn't it? It's a little unlikely that there's ischemia everywhere without the patient having something bad happen to them. Well, you don't know what has happened to them. Might be more likely that this is due to something more systemic like hypokalemia. Maybe this is just pan cardiac T-wave inversions, primary T-wave changes everywhere. But we're erring on the side of worrying about ischemia. Transmural means that it's all the way through one of the ventricular walls. Panmural might be that it's everywhere. What did I say, 50? Where are we? 53. Cassidy?
Okay, so I got sinus tachycardia, a heart rate of 110. I got PR of 0.2, QRS of 0.04, QT of 0.28, normal axis. And I saw biphasic P waves in V1, so I said left atrial enlargement. And then I thought there might be septal ischemia.
Septal ischemia due to what?
There's an inverted T wave on V1, and then V2, it kind of looked like there might be.
Okay, so this is one where what you have is an inverted T wave in V1, but it's not there in V2. So you don't have contiguous leads. If you want to call a primary T wave change in V1, you can call it, but when it's isolated in V1, it's usually not very important. You need to look for those contiguous leads. So I wouldn't call an ischemic change here. Anything else? Yeah.
We saw a right atrium enlargement. I know we just kind of started talking about the P waves, but to me they looked a little bigger.
Yeah.
In one
I
and two.
don't think they are. I mean, they're only two small boxes in lead 2, whereas the R wave is 9 boxes. Maybe start making that rule of a third or half. Make it look. Otherwise, you're going to be overcalling it. Anyone worry about the ST T waves in 2, 3, and F?
I was just gonna ask if you saw elevation in 2-3.
I did. I saw elevation of the STT waves at 2, 3, and ABS. Everyone see that? Don't know what that means. There's no Q wave, so it's not an infarct, but I would call it because it's there. So this is a primary STT wave change in the inferior leads, if you want to call it. If you want to call it ischemia, you can. If you want to call it injury, you can. But it's, or you might just want to call it what it is, elevated ST segments in the inferior leads. On an exam, you can have an EKG that looks like this, and it might say inferior ischemia, and that would be an appropriate answer. Anything else on this one? 4. Hannah?
Okay, we got sinus rhythm, heart rate of 80, PR of 0.16, QRS of 0.04, QT 0.40. The axis we got normal, and then we got anterior septal acute infarct at the normal axis, which is the Q wave in V1 through 4.
Anteroseptal and lateral infarct?
We just said anterior septal acute infarct.
Acute, okay. Anything else? Yes?
We got age indeterminate anteroseptal infarct.
Age indeterminate. So the difference between acute and age indeterminate would be how you're looking at the ST segment, right? The age indeterminate would be that the ST segment's on the baseline and the T wave's still inverted. This ST segment in V2, V3, and V4, or even in V5, is pretty convex. That's why they're calling it acute. I would call it acute as well. Anything else? You're probably, I can't remember exactly for sure, but you're probably not going to be asked on a test to choose between age indeterminate and acute infarction. It's not very important. What's important is you're picking up the infarct. 55. If you are asked to do that, you can,
Was that 100% on the test?
what?
Was that 100% on the test?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Was that 100% on the test?
It was what, 100%?
The last question, like, was that the only findings, that acute MI?
Oh. That's all I have.
Okay, 100%.
Is there anything else? That doesn't make it 100%, it just means we got the same
My
thing.
suspicion.
See how much you want it to be 100%? It's natural. It's not abnormal. It's a natural thing. It's just that there isn't any such thing.
Nothing in medicine is always, and nor is it never. Ever, ever.
Kathleen?
I got sinus rhythm, heart rate 70, PR 0.16, QRS 0.08, QT 0.4, and then the only findings I had were inverted T wave in V1, maybe slightly elevated ST, but not contiguously, so I didn't.
What'd you find for the axis?
Normal.
Yeah, we won't find a normal axis here.
I
I found a negative axis. It's negative in 3 and it's negative in F. So both of those negatives pull it up into that left upper quadrant.
My vector was like a
Oh, so you were saying, you were using my definition of normal. I changed mine.
What should we do for the test?
For the test, use the entire quadrant.
Okay,
The entire quadrant. If your arrow winds up in the entire quadrant, call it left axis. You'll be better off, easier. It's also easier, that's the way Jacob did it. He was just using 1 and F, and he was calling the whole quadrant left axis. And it depends on which author you read as to which way you do it. I've been teaching it -30 or greater for 30 years, so that's the way it is in this book. But it's probably more commonly taught today as the whole quadrant.
Last year you said that was a normal EKG.
Yeah. Yeah. 56. Karen?
I got sinus tachycardia with a heart rate of about 100, PR 0.1 .20, QRS .08, and I couldn't really find a good QT to,
Yeah, they're hard to find.
I got axis of, normal axis at about 70, a aneuryseptal infarction, which I said was acute, with the T waves in V1 to V3, and inverted T waves, and left atrial enlargement, and first degree AV1.
Any additional findings? Yes.
Sinus tap.
Oh, sorry.
I had mine at .2.
I did say the conclusions.
What was your rate?
I got 100.
So it's sinus tack.
I felt like the right atrial enlargement helped.
Thought those, in relationship to the R waves, the P waves were too high. Okay, anything else?
I found the left ventricular aneurysm. And the anal, and the anterior leads.
So instead of an acute infarct, you thought it was an old infarct with an aneurysm?
Yeah, I said that there was an acute septal infarct and then a left ventricular aneurysm. Because it has the Q waves, elevated ST segments, and the upright T waves.
So you were separating these out. You thought one was old and one was acute. Where did you think the old one was?
I didn't put an old anterior.
Well, but if you're calling it an aneurysm, it has to be old.
Okay. Then I called it
Aneurysms
AV.
don't form quickly. They form over time. So if you're implying that there's an aneurysm, it's an old infarct.
Okay, then I'm calling it in V2, or sorry, V3 and V4. Since there's Q waves, there's an elevated ST segment and an upright T wave.
So that's also true in V2.
So, but I thought in V2, like it goes down, like it kind of goes up and then it flatlines and it goes down. Is that an upside down P wave or T wave?
It's an elevated ST segment.
Yeah, but then if you look, keep going, then it goes down again. So is that the P wave or the T wave where it's inverted?
Well, so when you have these ST segments that are elevated, what's happening is the geometry of the geometry of this ST gets all distorted,
Okay.
okay? Because it starts up here, it gets slurred down here. So probably that's the T wave, and probably that's the segment. But it's hard to know because it's all distorted, okay? I think the point is that V2 and V3 look so much alike, they're most likely the same event.
Okay. So it'd be an old.
Well, if you want to call it old with an aneurysm, that's not a bad reading. If you want to call it an acute aneurysmal infarct, that's a good reading. Okay? You will not be asked to differentiate those two things. Probably. Can't remember the exam exactly. Looks like that.
When that ST segment flattens out, just like you through that, it shows that in the first and the third QRS complex in V3, to where it like comes to a point, flattens out for 1 millimeter and then comes up. Is that a J point?
The J point? Yes.
And is that what you were saying that goes with the aneurysm? I think that's what
Well,
she was.
the way I think of aneurysms most clearly is that the J point is distinct. So when the J point is distinct and you've got this ST segment, that's different than when there is no distinct J point. This is much more convex. So this is clearly acute. When the J point's distinct, I wonder about its age and begin to think more about aneurysm.
And I think that's what led her to that interpretation.
Yeah, if you interpret this as an old with an aneurysm, then it's old with an aneurysm V2, V3, and V4.
Okay.
Okay? Anything else? 57. Oakley?
I thought it was a regular tachy rhythm, heart rate of about 110, PR of 0.28, QRS of 0.08, QT of 0.24. I got a normal axis of 65 degrees, and for my findings, I got first degree AV block, and then I got ischemia inferior.
You got what?
Inferior ischemia, or I guess T-wave inversion on 2, 3, and AVF.
Inferior infarct, age?
No, ischemia.
Oh, ischemia. No infarct?
I got an
Anybody else get a different rhythm besides sinus? What was it?
I said irregular.
You thought what? Nonsense?
Non-sinus, I thought those were T waves in lead one, and not P's.
Non-sinus, that's not a rhythm. That's everything except sinus.
We got regularly irregular.
So it's definitely irregular.
What?
Regularly irregular.
It's irregularly irregular.
Is it irregular or?
Okay, so
We
the
got
thing is,
regularly irregular.
tell me what the regularity is.
That it would come like on 3, like they were the same, and then a long one. You know, you had 3 that were kind of the same width apart, and then the long one.
So it's irregular.
Is that true throughout the entire
No.
rhythm strip?
What else?
Is it regular, so
It's
you can
irregularly
read this
irregular.
EKG if you want. Across the entire spectrum horizontally as a rhythm strip.
So in that case, it would be irregularly.
That's it? No, that's too.
This is atrial fibrillation. This is the most difficult arrhythmia to recognize.
Way to go.
And it's the place where I find calipers or a piece of paper where you're marking things the most useful. If you're not sure whether there's a P wave before each QRS, pull out a piece of paper and mark it and move it along, or use
So it
calipers.
was variable.
Otherwise, it's going to be really
How big is the
difficult to
variance
pick up atrial
before this
fib,
call?
especially when it's fast. What's the ventricular rate here? Yeah. So this is turns out a really, really important EKG. First, you got to pick up that it's atrial fib, and then you got to pick up that it's a fast ventricular response. Okay? So this is atrial fibrillation with a rapid ventricular response. You remember that what's happening in atrial fibrillation is that instead of the atria contracting, they're just kind of quivering. And periodically, electricity gets through the AV node and goes down the His bundles, and the ventricles fire. But that business of the electricity getting through the AV node is irregularly irregular. So the R waves are irregularly irregular. And when it becomes rapid, the ventricles don't have time to fill during diastole. So the patient can get really hypotensive. Their cardiac output can fall, and this can be a dangerous rhythm. You need to slow this heart down. The way you slow this heart down is to block that AV node with calcium channel blocker and slow down the conduction through the AV node, and then the ventricles have time to fill. Does that make sense? The calcium channel blocker will not convert the atrial fib to a sinus rhythm, but it'll slow it down so the ventricles have time to fill. Okay, any other questions about this EKG?
Did we decide that this was inferior?
I called it an inferior infarct. I would not, on the other hand, put on boxing gloves and fight about it,
Okay.
because I could accept the argument that the Q waves are not wide enough or not deep enough or something. but they're there in all three leads. And I can argue that they're there. And this patient had an inferior infarct some time ago. I don't know when it was. It could be acute. The STT waves look. Yeah, I'd call this acute. The STT waves are convex. Anyone else find an inferior infarct here? How many found an inferior infarct? More than half the class.
A little bit of
Okay.
ischemia.
58. Jessica?
So, for the rhythm, I got irregularly again. Heart rate of 160, PR of 0.16, QRS of 0.04, QT of 0.36. Access was normal. Had artifact in like 1, 2, and 3 because those looked pretty odd. And then I found peaked like T waves in 2, 3, and V2 through V6.
T waves?
Yes. I didn't know. I mean, I just kind of put that because it looked kind of odd. Not
They're taller than the R's.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so there was called that atrial fibrillation with rapid ventricular rate.
Good. Okay, so there's atrial fibrillation with rapid ventricular rate. And if there is, which there is, you can't have a PR
Oh, that's true.
because there are no P waves. Well, it's not to say there are no P waves, but there are these squiggles that are not P waves causing the QRS. So if you call it atrial fib, you can't call it PR interval. Make sense?
Would we ever need to make the distinction of fine versus coarse AFib?
Say it again.
Do we ever need to make the distinction of fine versus coarse AFib?
I don't know that distinction. Do you know the definitions?
Dr. McNeil gave us pictures and said, this one's fine, and this one's
That was
What did he mean
B-fib,
by
not
Oh,
A-fib.
AFib.
That was fine B-fib, not A-fib.
Okay.
So
It was ventricular.
it was ventricular fibrillation, and the difference was that coarse VFib is more dangerous than fine VFib.
The smaller it got meant that there's more cardiac muscle that's dying and it's getting ready to go into an agonal rhythm and then asystole. So obviously, the one that's smaller is more dangerous.
The one that's smaller is coarse?
I don't know.
Do you want to see my pictures?
No.
Okay. That's what,
Fine is small.
yeah.
And then I don't know. Course is the one. So course is.
The reason that Dan is focused on that is that he teaches ACLS,
Right.
and that's real important in ACLS. Although VFib is VFib
Exactly.
in
You need to treat it
ACLS.
fast. You don't
You have to worry about
have
that.
chickens or sheep.
59.
I got a sinus rhythm, normal sinus rhythm, heart rate of 65, PR of 0.28, QRS of 0.08, QT 0.28, the axis LAD. I put first degree AV block, and then I thought maybe a right bundle branch for V1, V6.
Yeah, V1 and V6 look like right bundles. So does V1. You got the rabbit ears in V1. So there's a right bundle.
Rabbit ears and B2 also.
I think the QT is a little longer than 0.28. It looks to me like it's about 0.44. What?
I got 148.
48. It's pretty long.
Especially when you look at leads 1 and 2.
Left axis deviation, right bundle branch block, first degree AV block. On QT. Anything else?
In V4 and V5, it kind of looks like there's something in the, yeah, there's something like a P wave, like hiding in there. There's a bump.
In the ST segment? So look at we said, V1 and V6 with the right bundle branch block have this S wave down here in the QRS that's kind of wide.
There's something like a bump.
Yeah, so what is happening in V5 is it's trying to look like V6 because of the right bundle. And that bump is just the electricity coming through the myocardium in a funny way. You know, we never know exactly how it's going to look.
How do you distinguish that from, because I know one of the things that we learned about third degree AP block is that if there's a P wave or something like that hiding in there, that's something to really watch out for. That's like.
So,
Yeah, that's true, and that's a good rule to remember. One of the ways I would do it is if I worried about V5, you'd also worry about V4. Right? I would go back over here to the limb leads and see if it's there. See if in the limb leads there's a P wave hidden somewhere in the STT, and there isn't. So this is conduction through the myocardium doing funny things.
More importantly though, when you're looking at and worried about a second or third degree block, your heart rate's going to be slow, it's going to be gradient, and it's going to
Should be slow.
So that should be your first rule of thumb, to be able to rule that out and not try to make things be hidden. And then look at all the other P waves and measure those and see if they're consistent. Because a third degree especially is going to be inconsistent throughout. But your rate is going to be really important to know.
So is the bradycardia specifically for second and third degree, not necessarily first degree?
Correct. You can have a normal sinus rhythm with the first degree, it'll just be a prolonged PR interval.
Okay, I read something in my book, and this is what confused me again, was that if it's greater than 40, then it's coming from the AV node, and the third, if it's less than, it's coming from the.
If what's greater than 40?
The heart rate. The heart rate.
Yeah, so Jacob covered this too. He said that the pacemaking rate of the sinus is 60 to 80. Of the AV node, 40 to 60. Of the ventricle, 20 to 40 or something like that. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, and that's what kind of confused me is that.
And so if the ventricular rate, if you've got a third degree AV block and the ventricular rate is 60, you've got ventricular tachycardia. You've got a third degree block with ventricular tachycardia, which is, you have to first find if there is a third degree block by finding the P waves marching through, and then if the ventricular rate's greater than it should be, it's a tachycardia. Did we do 60? Not yet. Jenna, can you do 60?
Yep. All right, and I got sinus tachycardia. But I did see acute inferior myocardial infarction.
Good. Okay, so the most important thing on the CKG is the inferior infarction, right? And are you beginning to look at 2, 3, and F as a group?
Yeah.
And you're beginning to look at V1 through V3 and 4 as a group, 1 and AVL as a group, and AVR doesn't belong to any group. So your eye is kind of drawn to this inferior infarction, and in fact, it's the most important finding here. Now, what do we think about the STT waves in V1 or V2, V3, V4? Anyone call those anything? What? Depressed. You just write down depressed STs in V2, 3, and 4. Didn't interpret them as anything. Aneuroseptal ischemia. Okay. So, if all all you did was read this article in JAMA about this systemic review, this would have a likelihood ratio for acute coronary syndrome of 2.7 or 3. On the other hand, there's something on the EKG that probably explains it. The ST segments are elevated in 2, 3, and F. That's the inferior wall. The wall opposite that is the anterior wall. And so these are probably what we call reciprocal changes, right? It's a reciprocal, it's a mirror image, if you will, upside down instead of left to right. It's a mirror image of the inferior ST segment elevation. So you call reciprocal changes when it makes sense as a mirror image. It could be, on the other hand, it could be that this person has an acute inferior infarction and they're also ischemic in the anterior leads, you know? Could be. Don't know until you investigate. Yes?
Was there a first degree AV block on this one? Because I got a long PR.
Is there a first degree AV block? What'd you get for PR?
0.20.
I put down 0.28, but it's close. It's, I can see in lead 2 where you might worry about it. If you call it at 0.2 or greater and you call it a first degree block, you're not wrong. You know, where that P wave exactly starts is iffy in all of these. Any other questions about this one? All right, so we have tomorrow and Monday. All right, you got an exam on Tuesday. It's an EKG exam. Is that the only exam you had that day? Yes. So we got a couple of options. We can do all the rest of them tomorrow.
No, we have a registry test tomorrow.
Yeah, what?
A test tomorrow.
A test.
Tomorrow.
Oh my goodness. Cardiac stuff?
Yes.
Medical terminology.
Huh?
Medical terminology.
Medical
Over the cardiac system.
So you say no, let's just do 10 more tomorrow and 10 more on Sunday, or Monday. You want to do it Sunday? I won't be here, I'll be in the Panhandle. You can do 10 more tomorrow. If you feel really confident about your stuff, then you wouldn't have to come on Monday. I'll show up on Monday to go over the last 10 if anyone wants to show up. A lot of you are going to feel perfectly confident without the last 10, worried about the last 10. I don't think there's anything new, it's just more practice. So I'll be here both days. All right?
Thank you.